So thank you very much, Michelle, for that introduction. I need not say anything more about myself. So as you can see on the screen, I would like to talk to you about dialogue and preventing violent extremism in Uganda. But before that, I would like to tell you about my peace education studies at Uppsala Rotary Peace Center. So the Rotary Peace Foundation awards master's and professional certificate scholarships to 50 people each year. And some of the Rotary Peace Centers include Duke University in the United States, the University of Queensland in Australia, Makerere University in Uganda, which is new. There's also University of Bradford in England, and some other universities. And I happened to obtain a scholarship at Uppsala University, which was my first choice. So I'm very excited about that. So the foundation provides funding for tuition, accommodation, and other university fees. And we are currently studying a Master of Social Science in Peace and Conflict, which is a 2-year course. That is us who are part of the Rotary Peace Fellows, class 19. At the Uppsala Rotary Peace Center. So the department basically trains us to understand and assess the causes and resolution of armed conflicts scientifically. And some of the courses that we learn include emerging security threats, international conflict resolution, and research. But we also engage in an applied field experience. And this is like an internship or a volunteership, which we are sponsored to do in any region, as long as we are accepted into a program that's willing to build our capacities. And also this experience prepares us to get back into the workforce after studying. So my favorite part about the Rotary Peace Fellowship is the applied field experience. And in the background, you can see a quote by a Rotary Peace Fellow alumni called Bijay. And he's talking about what he has gained from the applied field experience. But for me, what I would like to obtain from this experience is to build my capacity in my niche area. And my niche area in peace and conflict over the past 5 years has been in counterterrorism and preventing violent extremism. And what I would like the outcome to be, based on not only just the academic experience, but also the applied field experience, is to be able to increase my chances in obtaining a PhD in peace psychology. And I have my eye on an academic institution called University of Notre Dame, and it has this specific course. So the reason why I'm interested in doing peace psychology is because there's a gap in understanding the individual risk factors of radicalization and terrorism, especially in Uganda. So I would like to use this new knowledge to influence mindset change, and influencing this mindset change is basically reducing intolerance as well as increasing respect for diversity between different faith groups as well as cultures. But one way that I currently contribute towards this mindset is through a concept called dialogue. But before I get into what dialogue is and how I engage in dialogue, let me just give you a context of violent extremism in my country. So in this picture, you will see a summary of my experiences in preventing violent extremism research that I was engaged in with Allied Muslim Youth and Wasafiri Consulting in 2018-2019. And to the left of this picture, you'll see some members of the Allied Democratic Forces, which is an Islam-based violent extremist rebel group with a mission to overthrow the government of Uganda and set up a government that's based on the Sharia law. And to the right-hand side, these are some factors that drive people in the region of Busoga, that's the eastern region of Uganda, to engage in violent extremism as well as be susceptible to being recruited by the Allied Democratic Forces. So you can just see a few of those. But what stood out for me in this research experience was a specific story about a boy who unfortunately, his father was recruited into this rebel group. Thereafter, two of his brothers were also recruited, and then he was finally recruited. And the community in Busoga knew about these events, and they called them disappearances, because the word violent extremism or extremism doesn't exist in our local dialects, right? Like Lusoga or Uganda. So during this research, we learned from the community members that people were being recruited under the guise of promises to work, because this is a poverty-stricken area. Like they would walk up to youth and ask the youth, would you like some work? We can take you to mine in Democratic Republic of Congo because there's a lot of gold, or we can give you scholarships to go to Saudi Arabia or Libya. And at the end of the day, people would get recruited both involuntarily as well as voluntarily. So it so happened that the sect that was championing this allied democratic forces was the Salafi sect. And the Salafis are part of Muslims. So unfortunately, that means that there was distrust between the Salafi and the government continuously targeted the Salafi unfairly because of that presumption that all of them were dangerous and all of them were extremists. So this only worsened the radicalization in the area. But with regards to this specific boy who I was talking about in the story, he happened to escape and come back, and he was granted amnesty. But the problem was that there were no opportunities for reconciliation with the community for his past crimes. And the fact that the mainstream Islam within the region, that's the Sunnis, they perceive the Salafi as pariahs and extremists. And also the fact that his family is gone, there was nothing there for him. So he decided to go back to the Allied Defense Forces, where he had a sense of belonging and livelihood. So as you can see on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see all the factors that kind of relate to the story of this boy in terms of security force abuse, in terms of animosity towards Muslims, in terms of family members being recruited, in terms of the ideological reasons and the poverty. So all these things touch on violent extremism, and it's very complicated to try and solve this problem. Just bringing back former fighters and giving them some money is not going to help how people in the community feel about who they are as Muslim Salafis, or who they are as people. And this is why I talk a lot about the concept of dialogue. And that's why I also engage in it and build capacities towards this. So in this picture, this is me training young faith leaders in interfaith dialogue within that same community in the eastern region, but also in central Uganda. And within this training, I basically shared with other peace practitioners and professors about how different faith groups can collaborate, how to tackle propagandism, and also how to identify conflict resolution mechanisms that they can engage in to fight radicalization. So also participants basically engage in a dialogue session about their differences and their stereotypes, and busting those stereotypes so that they can get to know each other from a common ground, as opposed to their differences and overcoming the hatred that they have inherently for themselves. So the intended outcomes of training these young faith leaders in interfaith dialogue is so that they can go back to their constituencies in the churches and in the mosques, and also train their people so that they can be less intolerant towards the others. That's the other people from the different faith groups. And there are different levels of dialogue. And this dialogue is just basically bringing different people together, such as Muslims, Protestants, Catholics, or people from different cultures, so that they can be able to discuss the problems that make them intolerant between each other, but also develop solutions to the problems that influence that hatred and intolerance. So this specific type of dialogue that we were training on was at the community level. But then the community level has its challenges. And I have engaged in also national dialogue, which uses what they call a whole of society approach. And this is an example of when I was a program specialist for peace and national reconciliation at the Interreligious Council of Uganda. There is a program called the Uganda National Dialogue Process, and it basically is multidisciplinary, multisectoral, and multicultural. That means that within this dialogue, it's like everyone important is involved. That means the government ministries, civil society organizations, academicians, the private sector, and most importantly, the local people. Because the local people are the ones who are both the victims as well as the perpetrators. And the point of this is, just to give you an example, within the previous dialogue that I had showed you in the previous slide, if it's a dialogue between two different sects or sectors, like for instance, the police and then the ex-combatants, it might be difficult to engage them and to have an objective conversation about their grievances, because the police will always look at former fighters as perpetrators and nothing more. They will always, and there was one example where I was in a dialogue in Namayingo in Busoga region when we invited police officers to talk with the former rebels, and one police officer went running, chasing after a former rebel, saying that he had run away from the prison cell. So it's kind of difficult if you don't include other actors such as religious leaders and traditional leaders and other politicians. And this is the whole essence of the whole of society approach. But you can also see where you can see that the small ticks, these outlines, these highlighted areas are some of the thematic areas that are discussed within the Uganda National Dialogue. And these thematic areas touch on those drivers of conflict that I showed you in the previous slide. For example, if we talk about a diversity consensus, as an ethnically and religiously diverse nation, as Uganda, where we have like over 50 possibly tribes with different languages and different religions, it's very important to have a consensus on what values, what national values we should have, so that we are all on the same page, as opposed to always thinking that our values from our specific tribes are better than other people's values. And then also having a national identity is important, because as we know, we are trying to get rid of the us versus them and to create a united front where we can all say that we have this objective and this is who we are as Ugandans. And it was actually great to learn that Canada has a platform called the National Dialogues and Action Forum, but it's basically at the education level. Although it's nationally oriented, it does focus on targeting the leaders of tomorrow, basically, and it's always important to have a critical mass of people. So that's another mechanism and a different approach, but it's very important to have a national dialogue ultimately. So we then have a question about what Rotary can do to engage in preventing violent extremism, as well as preventing identity conflicts. So what approach could, for instance, Rotary E-Club Premier take in promoting dialogue within your communities? So there's a gentleman called Gary Bass, and he's a professor at Princeton, and he basically says, we are all atrocitarians. And that basically means we all have a part to play in preventing atrocities, including hate crime. And this is by binding people together in dialogue within this specific context. So there's enough room for all Rotary clubs to engage in conflict prevention, I believe. And although the context between Uganda and Canada is different, an analysis would have to be made in order to identify which thematic areas you would focus on as Rotary 70-40, for example. But the most important thing is that Rotary has a very strong structure from the high schools where you have the Interact clubs, and then you have the Rotaract clubs in the communities, and then you have the districts and the zones, and then you have Rotary International with its very, rich, with its richness in terms of connecting all these different clubs together. It means you basically have access to communities. You have access to that critical mass of people who you need to change their mindsets. And also, the Rotary is embedded in the principle of diversity. It's whenever I speak to Rotary clubs, I'm just fascinated and excited about the principles of tolerance and diversity. To sit in this platform and just see different people from different cultures speaking different languages, it comes with ease. But then outside of Rotary, in the communities, it's different. People are not getting along. So it's important to figure out how you actually exercise these principles seamlessly so that they can also be adopted within the communities around you. So opportunities for action. There are so many things that have to be done, so many information to learn about, but the quickest, the things on the fingertips for now in terms of if you are interested in engaging in dialogue, right? The first thing for me is always building our capacities. And I think many of you know that Rotary International and the Institute for Economics and Peace have a platform called the Rotary Positive Peace Academy. And it's a free training course where you can open this platform in your own leisure hours and finish the course in your own time. But you basically get the tools and resources to learn about positive peace and be able to contextualize them and spread messages of peace, as well as learn the mechanisms in which you can create safe spaces for dialogue within your communities. So at the end of the day, you'll be able to shape constructive identities among children and youth. And that means that you'll be supplementing on the work of the National Dialogue and Action under the Vice President's office within your country. And then you'll also be able to create those safe spaces for intercultural dialogue. And as I mentioned, as much as you might not have a prevalence of religious violent extremism, the extremism in Canada and the Western world is politically oriented in terms of the left and the right and the conservatives and neo-Nazism. So those things might not be in Africa, but then they are starting to become global and they're beginning to spill over. So it would be great to have Rotary as an active part in preventing violent extremism from the political perspective. So this is it for my presentation, and I'd just like to thank you for this platform, but also thank you very much as Rotarians for supporting peace builders like myself to have this opportunity to get a qualification in the Master of Social Science in Peace and Conflict through the Rotary Peace Fellowship. Without you, capacities would not be built. And I also would like to thank you for the fact that you're serving to change lives, and that is something that I'm very passionate about. Thank you very much.